The party stands in the cobblestone streets of a large city. The combination of elvish and human architecture would be easier to appreciate if it were not for the blasted and torn landscape of the Nine Hells that now hosts this city. This place was ripped straight out of the material plane and shackled to the 9th layer of the Hells. The party heads to the center of the city, where they will find a greater chain devil, Zekuraath, the 9th shackle. He has bound this city to the 9th layer, and with the assistance of his chain weavers, he will harvest this city for every last soul it can offer. In this video, I will present you with a boss encounter for 5th edition D&D. The encounter has been designed for 4 to 5 players at around 10th level. At the end of the video, I will cover some ways you can adjust the difficulty of the fight. So, let's begin. There are a handful of mechanics to be aware of as part of this fight, so we're going to cover those first. Fiendish Minions. At each initiative count 10, 1d4 greater imps using the Minions mechanic will enter combat. For each round of combat after the first, add a +1 to the amount of greater imps that arrive each turn, up to a maximum of +4. The Chains of Nessus. The area surrounding Zekuraath is entangled by thousands of metal chains that slither as if they were alive. While the chain weavers are maintaining the Chains of Nessus, any non-devils within 300 feet of Zekuraath will accumulate stacks of the Shackled Debuff. At the start of a non-devil's turn, if they are within the Chains of Nessus, they gain 1 stack of Shackled. Chain Weavers. 4 chain weavers are present on the battlefield. These lesser chain devils are each a writhing mass of chains that work in unison to control the Chains of Nessus. A chain weaver must be within 300 feet of Zekuraath in order to maintain the Chains of Nessus. If a chain weaver is killed or cannot maintain the Chains of Nessus, any creatures with the Shackled debuff lose 1 stack of Shackled. If no chain weavers are alive or maintaining the Chains of Nessus, Zekuraath loses his chain Shroud, and all stacks of Shackled are lost. Creatures will not begin to regain stacks of Shackled until the Chains of Nessus can be reinstated. It takes 3 turns before a new chain weaver arrives to take a dead one's place. When a new chain weaver arrives, it immediately reinstates the Chains of Nessus, granting Zekuraath his Shroud if he does not have it. Shackled. This is a stacking debuff. As a creature gains stacks, it accumulates all the negative side effects for each stack that it has. With 1 stack, you cannot take reactions. With 2 stacks, your movement speed is halved. With 3 stacks, you may use either an action or a bonus action on your turn, not both. With 4 stacks, you are grappled by the Chains of Nessus. You may use an action to break free of your grapple with an athletics check with a DC of 15. If you succeed, your stacks of Shackled resets to 1. Devil's Blood. If a non-devil kills a devil within 5 feet, they are covered in its blood, gaining the Devil's Blood buff until the end of their next turn. Having this buff means the chain weavers cannot sense you. You lose any stacks of Shackled that you had, and do not gain any stacks while having this buff. Zekuraath's Chain Shroud. While the chain weavers grant Zekuraath his Chain Shroud, he may use any Chain Shroud attacks. He has an armor class of 23, is resistant to all damage, and cannot be targeted by spells that require the caster to see the creature. His movement speed is reduced to 0 while in the Shroud. Here are the stat blocks for each of the enemy types. So this fight will predominantly take place within a 300-foot area around Zekuraath. The chain weavers will be in this area maintaining the Chains of Nessus. The Chains of Nessus have a couple purposes in the fight. One is that the chains provide Zekuraath his Chain Shroud, which makes him very hard to kill, as well as gives him much more damage and range on his attacks. Additionally though, the chains also debuff all non-devils in the area with the Shackled debuff, causing them to gain a stack at the start of every turn. But once the Chains of Nessus go away, they lose all of those stacks and don't gain them until the Chains of Nessus is brought back up by the chain weavers. There are a couple ways, however, for the players to avoid the Chains of Nessus entirely. The Devil's Blood buff allows players to essentially cleanse themselves of the Shackled debuff and stay cleansed until the end of their next turn. This is why the minion imps are so important. They act as a source for this buff, but must be right next to the player when they kill it in order for the player to receive the buff. Also, the players can simply just kill the Chain Weavers to get rid of the Chains of Nessus, which is how you defeat Zekuraath. This encounter is set up somewhat similarly to encounters you might find in raids from other RPG video games like World of Warcraft or Destiny. The Chains of Nessus not only causes players to seek out the Devil's Blood buff, but also pushes them to kill the Chain Weavers, which, in turn, activates what is essentially a damage phase, where Zekuraath loses most of what made him hard to kill. Importantly, the Chain Weavers also respawn in some sense after 3 rounds of being dead, so strategy and timing will be important for your players. Some tips for you DMs looking to run this fight might be that, when setting up the encounter, be mindful of where you put the Chain Weavers. The Chain Weavers will need to be killed if players want to stand a fair chance of beating Zekuraath. If the Chain Weavers are too far away from each other for your players, it may make the fight harder than you thought it would, especially if none of the players have good ranged attack options or movement options. Also, in that same vein, be mindful of where your imp minions are coming from. Are they just running in from the edges of your map? Are they emerging from the sewers? Perhaps they're being summoned magically. However you plan to do it, just make sure they are spread out quite well, because you want all your players to have an equal shot of nabbing themselves that Devil's Blood buff. Some ways I would look at balancing this encounter around your party size and level is to firstly look at enemy count. Fundamentally, this encounter relies on players being able to kill the Chain Weavers efficiently enough to not die. The amount of Chain Weavers dictates the difficulty in bringing Zekuraath into his vulnerable phase. Potentially something to watch for is, if your players seem pretty beat up at the time that they finally clear all the Chain Weavers for the first time, then you might make a call in the moment to extend the time that it takes for Chain Weavers to respawn, or simply never even bring back another Chain Weaver if you don't think your players would survive that. If the players are doing very well, perhaps quicken the amount of time that it takes for the Chain Weavers to return. Now, in the vein of enemy count, I wouldn't reduce minions too much, because they are an easy source of Devil's Blood buff for the party. In fact, the fight might be made easier by giving the minions less attacks and a worse armor class, but adding more minions to the fight. Though do keep in mind, Zekuraath's legendary action, Obey, causes all of his allies to make an attack. Now, of course, the other way to adjust difficulty would be with Zekuraath himself. Things I would adjust first on him would be his plus to hit, as well as the amount of chains he can animate, because those 2 things are going to greatly impact his overall damage output. Then after that, you could start looking at things like hit points and armor class. Though do note that his high armor class is intentional as part of his Shroud. But he only has a 16 armor class once he's out of his Shroud, so you could lower that even further if you wanted to guarantee hits. So that was the Zekuraath boss encounter. If you made it this far into the video, leave a comment letting me know what type of boss encounters you would like to see. And as always, thanks for watching.